My name is Man Yao, and I'm an assistant professor of Women Gender Studies program here. On behalf of the Laura C. Harris Series Committee, we have the pleasure of welcoming you to Why AI Needs Feminism with Dr. Lauren Klein. The Laura C. Harris Endowment stands as a tribute to Dr. Harris' memory, evidence of her clear commitment to women's achievement and reinforcement of her belief in the importance of undergraduate education. And this year and next, the LCH series, in collaborations across campus, seeks to deepen our knowledge, understanding, and engagement with complex global and local issues. Our current series theme, Shaping Feminist Futures and Possibilities, serves as a gathering space for Denisonians to consider their involvement in the pressing concerns of our times and in creatively imagining and building a just and viable future. Our theme, Shaping Feminist Future and Possibilities, foregrounds feminist engagement with the data and digital world, popular education and critical creative pedagogies, and feminist resistance to war. We extend gratitude to the LCH committee, faculty, staff, and students in data analytics, digital humanities, and the Women's and Gender Studies program, all of whom have been a part of the class visits, meals, and tonight's event, and especially to LCH series coordinator, Bevan Peppard. Dr. Lauren Klein is the Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in Quantitative Theory and Methods and English at Emory University. She directs the Emory Digital Humanities Lab and the Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network. Her research combines computational and critical approaches to examine gender, race, and justice. She co-authored with Catherine Denison the award-winning book, Data Feminism. In her visit to my Issues in Feminism class yesterday, she and students engaged with questions about teaching and applying feminist principles to data science and AI-related practices. And her next book, Data by Design, A History in 5 Charts, is forthcoming from MIT Press in 2025. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lauren Klein.
So much. How is this? Can everyone hear me in the back? Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for such a nice introduction. Thank you to Claire for all of your organizing and driving me around and everything. To Bevan for your amazing ensuring that everything is going smoothly, and Matt and Trey and Alex and Selena who drove me around yesterday. Everyone has been so nice and welcoming to me. It's been an amazing experience. And I will say, Data Feminism came out in the very first week of the pandemic. And so I actually haven't given that many in-person talks on this project. So seeing all of you in person, making time to come listen to me, it's an amazing feeling. Okay, so just to get started, I want to just acknowledge before moving forward that everything that I'm presenting today is co-authored work with Catherine D'Ignazio, who you can see up here. She's an associate professor of urban science and planning at MIT. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about our motivation for writing Data Feminism, sort of what we were thinking when we set out to start this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the feminism that's informing that project. And then I want to turn to the conversation around AI, which is taking place right now, and think through how the principles of data feminism can be applied in this sort of new or extended context, or need to be rethought given certain unfolding conditions. So I'm just going to jump right in. So, as we were starting to think about writing the book, we were becoming increasingly aware that data was this tremendous form of power. And I actually think sort of everyone was coming to this realization around this time. This is 2018, 2019. We were all learning from the researchers whose work you see up here on the screen. So Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, that talks about the racism that's encoded in Google search results. Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality, that talks about the way in which poor people are unduly punished in child welfare systems. I could go through sort of all of these, Surya Matsu, Julia Angwin, Ruha Benjamin, Joy Bolam-Weenie, Maggie Smith, and the folks in the world of indigenous data sovereignty. You know, what all of these works were together pointing to was the fact that, like, yes, data was incredibly powerful, but that power was at that point being wielded deeply unequally. And specifically, it was being wielded by this very small and homogenous groups of institutions, corporations, and governments who had the resources and the training to make decisions about the design and the deployment of these data systems, usually for their own profit. And when their profit was the goal, it usually came at the expense of everyone else. And this is where Catherine and I really saw a place for feminism to enter in. And what we explain in the book is how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has been focused on precisely this issue. So imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. This has been the central project of feminism for a lot of years. And so, you know, in a contemporary context, we hear a lot of conversations today about, for example, I've been talking about this a little bit in classes, so people have heard me talk about this morning and yesterday, I apologize, but I actually think this is super interesting. So right now there's a lot of concern about what's called the brittleness of AI systems, by which people mean that these systems have been trained for certain situations and optimized for certain situations or for certain groups of users and not others. And when they're taken out of that training context and deployed in the world, they prove to be, they don't work. They prove to be brittle. And the people who are training and deploying these AI systems, they seem so surprised that sort of this narrow optimization task wouldn't work more broadly. But the very basic idea that systems, like not AI systems, but just all kinds of systems, political systems, social systems, are optimized for a smaller group or one particular group and not others. This is sort of a basic tenet of feminism, or a basic observation of feminism. You know, another issue that I think at this point, you know, everyone has heard about, but biased training data, right? This idea that biases are just sort of baked into the cultural record. This is sort of the ground truth of so much of feminist work. And so this is why Catherine and I really thought that there was a role, and an sort of interventionist role, that feminism could play into these conversations and even into the design of these data systems, because feminists had really thought through a lot of these sort of bigger conceptual problems that we were seeing play out in the data systems that were at that point being deployed on all of us. So I actually want to pause a minute before I move forward and talk a little bit about what I mean when I say feminism. And I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One, just to do some level setting, because I know that there are people here from gender studies, but there are also people here from data analytics. And so you might not be coming to the table with the same working definition. But I also think it's really important for anyone who says that they are a feminist to say what their feminism is. And this is something that Catherine and I thought a lot about when we were writing our books, or like, what is our feminism? What is important to us? And how do we want to articulate these principles in the book? And so very briefly, the feminism that Catherine and I mobilize in the book, at its core, is a simple one, and entails a belief in equality for all genders. This includes women and men, non-binary folks, cis and trans people, everyone. But very crucially, if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality hasn't been realized in the world. And so for both me and Catherine, it was very important that we couple this sort of basic belief in equality to a commitment to action, to taking steps to ensure that the goals that we had were actually experienced in the world. And then there's a third definition of feminism that Catherine and I bring to the table, and this is the kind of nerdy one, and it has to do with the set of theories and ideas that have come up through feminist scholarship. And these theories, too, began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But again, you know, the past decades, 40 years or so of scholarship, the persistent feedback people have been getting from their experiences in the world, this has brought many, many more dimensions of difference into the conversation. So this includes race, this includes class, this includes colonialism, location in the world, disability status or ability status, and so on. So this is sort of taking me full circle to this idea of intersectional feminism, which I said at the very beginning is really sort of the conceptual or theoretical basis for the book. And I think, again, this is a concept that, like in the year 2024, most people have heard about. They've heard the term intersectionality, and they even sort of believe that they adhere to a belief that you need to take into account sort of multiple axes of difference when considering people's experiences and opportunities in the world. But I think that it's really important to, again, be sort of explicit about the fact that intersectional feminism isn't just like a fuzzy concept. What it actually gives us are very precise models and sort of conceptualizations of how structural power works. So what they allow us to do when you think about ideas like the Combahee River Collective's idea of interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality. We talk a lot about Patricia Hill Collins's matrix of domination in Data Feminism. What these give us are these frameworks that help structure critiques of power. They really help atomize and help to understand the reason why certain people or groups experience privilege on the one hand or oppression on the other. And I think, again, it's important to be clear about the fact that these are things that help refine our critiques and our understanding, and they also help us sort of structure interventions. And so this is sort of taking me back to the book and what we're trying to do here, because what we try to do is really sort of operationalize theories of intersectional feminism and some other ideas from feminist science and technology studies and other ways of thinking that sort of come up through feminist thought, and really try to sort of explain what they are, try to walk through them through examples in the world that come from data science and data activism. And the goal is really to help people who want to work with data, who are already working with data but sort of want to do better, or people who want to refuse to work with data, to sort of provide them some conceptual basis and some practical examples of what they can do. And I guess I should say, in the book, we have, the structure of the book is that we have one chapter devoted to each principle: examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. But don't worry, I'm not gonna go through all the chapters one by one today. What I actually want to do is think a little bit about how those principles that we formulated before the world of ChatGPT, sort of how they carry forward into the present. Because as I mentioned before, I think that the current world in which we're living, dominated both by actual AI technologies and also this sort of aura or rhetoric of AI hype, actually connects very closely to some of the things that we said about data back in 2020. But I also think that there are additional conversations or considerations rather that come to the fore. These have to do with the environment. These have to do with the sort of increasing consolidation of capitalist power. These have to do with the militarized uses of these AI technologies. These were issues that were sort of bubbling below the surface, but we hadn't yet seen as broadly realized in the world as we do right now. So I'm gonna get to some of those additional considerations at the end of my talk, but I did wanna start with questions, by which I mean problems having to do with data, because many of the issues that we are encountering with these current AI systems are ultimately tied back to problems with the data that they're trained on. And so what I wanna do in the next section of my talk is talk about two of these kinds of data problems. One of them is missing data, and the other one is biased data. And what I wanna do is show how they have many, many downstream effects. I realize now I totally forgot to start my timer. And so yeah, just like wave at me if things are going deeply off task. But I think I'm doing okay, so I'm gonna start it now. Okay. So in data feminism, we use the example of this artwork. It's called The Library of Missing Data Sets by Mimi Onuoha. She's an artist, but she actually also teaches at NYU's ITP program. And we talk about this artwork as a way to get at these problems having to do with missing and biased data. And Onuoha makes a very similar point as we do about the unequal power that contributes to the existence of missing data. And she does this in two ways. The first is actually as a GitHub repository. That's what you see screenshotted on the left-hand side of the screen. And this just contains a list of what she classifies as missing data sets. So these are data sets that you would expect to exist in the world because they address issues of pressing social need, but they don't actually exist in real life. And then the second way that you can encounter her artwork is as a physical artwork in an exhibition. This is actually, it's been installed in like Bitforms, which is the leading sort of computational art gallery in New York. And you encounter it in this gallery space. In this case, the missing data sets are written on the tabs of the file folders, and you go to open up the folder and you think like, oh, this one looks interesting or worth learning more about. And you open the folder, but it's empty. So here the folder is, the data sets are physically missing. But the point that Onuoha is trying to make here is that these data sets are not missing arbitrarily. They're missing for a reason, and the reason has to do with this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So who has this power? Generally, it's corporations, governments, well-resourced institutions, and generally speaking, minoritized groups do not have this power to collect the same amount of data on the issues that matter to them. And so this is why a feminist approach to data and AI really needs to begin with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access and in turn analyze and begin to use to generate more knowledge, those data sets have already been overdetermined by power in the world today. And we may not even realize that there are questions, really important questions that we are unable to answer because the data does not exist to answer those questions in the first place. So another example, and a more profound and real world example of missing data has to do with the issue of feminicide. And in the book, we tell the story of a woman named Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen who identified the lack of data on this issue. So feminicide has to do with the gender-related killings of women and girls. And she identified that there was not data that documented what she knew to be the full extent of this issue. And she resolved to head sort of straight towards the problem and collect the data herself. So she's been working for 8 years, for 2 to 4 hours per day, just logging incidents of feminicide in a Google spreadsheet and then mapping them on this Google map that you see. Her data collection is so extensive that she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and to NGOs. And ironically, she's been called back in to testify in front of Mexican Congress about the issue of feminicide, for which there are laws on the books to prosecute, but the government does not devote resources to documenting or collecting data about. So they need to call her in, just a private citizen, to be the source of information for their own laws and provisions. So this is in the book what we talk about in terms of a form of feminist counter data. So this is sort of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to provide or ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. It's not the only way, and we can talk a little bit later if you're curious about the situations in which you do not want to collect data about a particular population. But this is one example where it is very valuable and effective. And I think we've seen another facet of missing data play out very visibly in LLM training data. So large language models, LLMs, it's sort of like the models that drive things like ChatGPT. So what we know about this training data, aside from it being large, it comes from the internet. And what we know about the internet is, well, the internet is many things, but it's not like a full and accurate representation of the world, right? So the internet skews young. The average creator of content on the internet is between the ages of 18 and 34. It skews male. I don't know stats on the internet writ large, but Wikipedia, which is a large chunk of this training data, the articles written in Wikipedia are authored, 89% of them are written by people who identify as male. It skews towards the United States, it skews towards the English language, it skews towards toxicity, and it's certainly not like the source of truth that some people interpret the output of things like ChatGPT to provide. But we all kind of know this already. And the thing is, so do the people putting together the training data for these models, right? Which is the reason why we've seen in the past several months, and maybe even like a year or so, this move towards more fully documented training data, more open source models. Like AI2 has this OMO family of models where they're really trying to be good about documenting every single source that goes into them. You see like Stanford has this like model transparency index where they're trying to give models a score as to how transparent they are and how open. And these efforts are certainly welcome. And I think that, we don't want to discourage them, but the underlying issue is this: until our world is free from bias, our training data won't be, right? And so we'll continue to need theories like feminism that help us understand how these biases work in the world. And the goal here is to first anticipate them before they enter into our systems, then account for them in ways that the models don't reproduce or amplify them, and ideally, finally, to challenge and change them. And I'll give you just one more example of a project that I've been involved with recently that has to do with the introduction of so-called AI scribes into medical offices. So these are AI assistants that listen into your visit between you and your doctor and then automatically synthesize the transcript of the encounter and put it into it's called the EHR, the electronic health record, that now the US government requires. And doctors are actually really excited about this possibility, and this is why I find this example really compelling. The documentation demands on behalf of doctors are excessive, and it's the single largest source of physician burnout when they poll doctors and say, like, why do you want to quit your jobs? It's all of this required reporting. So they really, really, really want to use AI to do something good. However, all of the issues with biased and undocumented training data that I was just talking about come into play here. And so, like, for example, if a story that a patient relates that's similar to one that's in the training data, the details can be sort of like merged in with some of the training data examples, or even worse, if there is identifying information that has to do with a particular demographic group, stereotypical anecdotes and examples can be introduced. These text-to-speech systems are really bad on non-normative, like sort of white Midwestern English. And so the quality of the transcriptions are much worse if you don't speak English in this particular accent. Again, because these are generative models and not logic-based ones, they can sometimes sub out like the name of the specific prescription that was prescribed. And if the doctor is not paying attention later on, this can all happen. Like the point here is that these are all known limitations and biases of these models. And the companies should know better before coming to medical offices and offering their service as something that is guaranteed to improve the patient and the doctor experience. Okay, that's already been a lot. I've already been talking for a while, but I just want to turn to one more example in a different sector where AI is being deployed everywhere, and this is housing. So the housing sector is experiencing like this whole host of AI systems being thrown at it right now. So these include everything from like credit scoring systems when you apply to rent an apartment, remote property management dashboards that help people out away from the property decide how and when to regulate all of the electricity and things like that, biometric screening for access to properties, and even more. And actually, Catherine has been working, because she works in this urban planning department, she's been working on a comment to the FTC about what tenant screening services. So they're essentially background checks that landlords can run on tenants before they offer them a lease. And it sounds harmless enough, but it turns out that what these sort of tenant screening algorithms pull for, the data that they draw from, are eviction records and arrest records. And these are two sources of data that in the United States are, A, of all, extremely low quality. For example, there's no separation between people who have been served with an eviction notice because their landlord wants to get them and people who have actually been evicted. There's no distinction in the data. And the second thing, they're extremely racialized. Everything we know about the policing system in the United States points to this fact. But we could go on. There's a lot more stuff to say about that. But I want to make a more general point about this that has to do with this question of power. If we examine power in the housing sector, it prompts a simple question. So why do landlords have so much data and algorithms and AI and all these things on their side such that they can know almost everything about tenants, Whereas tenants can know very little about their landlords, right? Like their history of evicting people unfairly or fixing broken things on the property. Like where are the technologies and the AI systems that help tenants build power, right? Why aren't we building those things instead of the ones that are these sort of top-down systems that are pushed from top to bottom? So just to sort of bring this up to another point of data feminism, the one having to do with challenging power, again, in the context of housing and technology, it would mean stopping the use of this discriminatory technology and then designing technologies that help tenants build up their own power so that they can sort of exist on an equal plane to the people who control their housing. So more broadly, like how can we work towards this world in which we have more of these AI systems that are designed to rebalance unequal power in the world rather than make existing power differentials even worse? And one of the data feminism principles has to do with embracing pluralism. This means just essentially listening and learning and incorporating a range of sources into our sort of combined source of knowledge. And we've actually started to see some of these practices of co-design and participatory design start to show up in data science and even sort of AI research. And one of Catherine's recent projects, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, has really tried to mobilize this principle in the specific case of an AI, or more specifically a machine learning system. And it's this. So the Data Against Feminicide project sort of set out to build AI systems and digital tools to support the data activists that I was talking about earlier, the ones who were invested in calling attention to the problem of feminicide around the world. And there are a lot of parts to the project, and I would encourage you to go look at this website and explore all of them. But the one that I want to talk about right now has to do with this participatory approach to AI. So Catherine and her team really prioritize listening to the data activists themselves and learning from them what tools they might need before setting out to just build a technology and give it to them and say, see, is this helpful for you or not? Because one of the things that was really important was that building tools was not a foregone conclusion. So Catherine and her group held brainstorming workshops to discuss whether and under what conditions digital tools could help. Or reduce some of the emotional burden of working with this really traumatic data, or whether it would just sort of displace that work and mean work of a different kind. And it's been a really iterative process. It's taken a really long time. But the important thing, I think, to draw out here is that the team did actually end up building 2 ML tools that do help the activists. And they're in use by over 40 human rights monitoring organizations. And I think that's a really powerful testament to the value of working with communities and working with groups and learning from them what technologies are needed, rather than coming in from the outside with all of the solutions up front. So in talking to Catherine throughout this project, so we sort of Catherine had to get tenure, so she had to go do her own thing, and then I was working on this history of data visualization project, but we continue to meet and talk about what we're up to. And one of the things that I found really interesting in talking with Catherine about this work was that the groups were very, very certain that they did not want to fully automate this work, even if this would mean saving them time. This is because the activists considered their work to be care work, to be memory work, and they saw the time that they spent processing the data records, sort of sitting with the facts and the stories that were relayed in these news reports and deciding how it would be transferred into a spreadsheet. They saw this as a way of sort of stewarding the memories, of honoring the memories of these murdered women. And part of the point of the project overall was refusing to let these women be forgotten by the state or the media. And so the activists didn't want to delegate this important work to some AI system that wouldn't take the same amount of care or time in order to do it. And so, this brings me back around to sort of a larger point, this idea that there is value in care work, that it's something that we might want to enable and encourage rather than just sort of speeding up and excising or putting to the side. Even there might be value in work that in other contexts might just be viewed as like data cleaning, sort of a task that no one wants to do. This brings me back to another principle of data feminism, which has to do with the importance of elevating emotion more broadly and questioning why it is so often so that things having to do with emotion are relegated to a sort of second tier. But in order to do that, I just want to take a little bit of a detour back to feminist theory land. Like, one of the things that hopefully you notice in the book, and those of you who I've spoken to a lot today know that, like, one of the things that I love is models and formulas, or sort of formalizations of otherwise very abstract ways of thinking. I love when you can draw a diagram that helps sort of crack things open. And ideally, you can sort of take this and apply it to other contexts. So here's a slide that I really love very much. And every time I think about taking it out, I keep it in. Anyway, so feminist theory, one of the things that it has done over the years is help to show how binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And the obvious example here is the gender binary, right? The idea of man and the idea of woman. We know that's a false binary because there are more than two genders. But once you see the hierarchy there, you start to understand why the hard line between those two groups is there in the first place. And it's there to be protective. It's there to ensure that the group with power on the top is able to stay there and doesn't have to share that power with the people on the bottom who are trying to get up and get in. But then one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this sort of structural critique of the gender binary and use it to critique other binaries and hidden hierarchies that we encounter in the world. And I think in the context of, so you could think of like nature and culture as like sort of a canonical one, and feminist science and technology studies. We talked earlier about feminist pedagogy, sort of questioning the binary between teacher and student. You can start to, once you sort of understand how this works, you can see how it can be really useful in a lot of different contexts. But I want to talk about this in the context of AI, because I think that this critique of false binaries and these sort of hidden hierarchies really helps cut through like the AI hype that we're experiencing right now. So on the one hand, we're being told AI is so good because it's rational and objective. It's like so much better than us humans who are deeply emotional and subjective, right? Like, this is why we should embrace it. So we have that thing going on. So that's sort of one of these binary distinctions that is also encoding a hierarchy. But then there's a second thing going on. There's also this claim that AI is like so magical and mysterious that us lowly humans like can't possibly even begin to understand how it works. And I really see this as a protective move. Because the thing is, big tech wants us to believe in these magical superhuman capabilities of their AI systems, because if they're too mysterious or too complicated for like us to, just regular people to understand, then these companies are let off the hook for the actual problems that their systems are causing in the world right now. And if you stop to think about it, even for a minute, these problems have very clear and direct sources that have to do with things like structural sexism or structural racism. So, this starts to bring me up to my conclusion. And so the sociologist Ruha Benjamin, I had her book Race After Technology up on a slide at the beginning of the talk, but she's written a whole series of books that all sort of take up this question. She's been writing recently about default settings. By this she means sort of like the options that, we know what default settings are. It's like the outcomes and the options of technology that if you leave them, if you don't do anything to them, they just reproduce what is supposed to happen, right? And so one of the things that Catherine and I have been trying to think through about the default settings with AI in a more metaphorical sense is to say sort of like the default settings for these AI systems will be to accelerate and to exacerbate sexism and racism and colonialism and more. The default settings for these AI systems will continue to concentrate power in the hands of the already powerful. For example, if you think about how AI has worked to throw technological heft behind landlords and leave tenants out in the cold. But the really important thing is this, as like for me as an AI researcher, for you as students who are learning about AI in the classroom, for people who are going into industry after graduation, like we don't need to accept these default settings. All they are just the default. They can be changed. And so this brings me really to the final point that I want to make, which I hope is pretty obvious by now. It's that AI needs feminism and even more, right? So when we look back, me and Catherine, to what we said about data feminism, in data feminism rather, about the centrality of power, that was really sort of depressingly prescient. But I think the growth of these models have brought even more considerations to the forefront, right? So for one, there are the environmental costs of training these systems, which take our already limited natural resources like water and energy away from people and communities and towards cooling data centers and powering GPUs. We were talking earlier about how 3 Mile Island, the site of like the worst nuclear disaster on US soil, evidently Microsoft's gonna turn that back on because they need more power to power their data centers. This is like, you can Google it, it was in the New York Times today. You know, there's an increasing amount of really good work taking place in this space, but I think we need more environmental studies scholars who are contributing to this conversation, in addition to people in the field of AI itself working on this issue. Then there are the human costs. You know, we've known for several years about, for example, the role that Amazon has played in providing cloud storage for the US military, also for ICE. This has been very well documented. We know how Google developed technology to make drone strikes more accurate, to the point where Google employees protested against the project and the contract that Google held with the US military. And then we know, and we're seeing this play out right now, both in Ukraine and in Gaza, in what people are calling the first AI wars, in which this AI technology is being used to target the actual drone, the sort of subjects of drone strikes. This is real people in the world that are experiencing, at the ultimate cost, these technologies that, you know, initially were intended to benefit humanity, right? And what we're seeing in the world is that they're wreaking the literal destruction of humanity instead. And so I think, you know, the stakes of this kind of work is really, really high. And as we're learning about this, and as we sort of throw up our hands at like some silly little thing or snafu that ChatGPT says or does to us, we also need to remember that there are these really broader and really profound contexts in which this technology is playing out in the world. But I do want to end on a note of hope. I didn't want to end on a total depressing tone. You know, these AI systems, they are incredibly powerful. Like, that is true. That's unassailable. But they're only as powerful as the data on which they are trained, the conditions under which they're developed, and the context in which they're put to use. And if we are going to imagine alternative conditions for their development and alternative contexts in which they might be deployed, so these are contexts that empower, not disempower, then feminism has a very clear role to play, right? You know, yes, it's an interventionist role. It's also a political one, because it's a role that challenges these default settings of these models and these data sets and these AI systems. And it does so with a goal that I hope that many of us in this room share, which is designing technologies that work towards liberation and not just resource extraction. So that's where I'm going to end. Here's like 500 different ways to get in touch with me if you have questions, but we do have a little bit of time to hear questions and comments from all you in the audience. I really thank you for listening and for giving me your attention. Oh yeah, that'd be great, thank you. I just turned it on, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of participatory AI design. I'm thinking like wiki storming and things like that, but what about AI? Can we intervene in the training? Like where and how?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So this is like the hot thing right now, participatory AI, and everyone is trying to figure out how to do it. And they are trying to take lessons from more successful instantiations of this that come from smaller scale tech development. So this is a lot of sort of like working with community groups and certain communities and saying like, you know, what are the issues that matter to you? What are some ways in which you could see those issues being resolved. Are there ways that we could design or co-design technologies to make them better? And really having to do with involving people who know the best about their lives in all phases of the design process, from the sort of project ideation to brainstorming, involving people even in like skills exchange and technical development, through the evaluation. And in the end, this is the really tricky one, the sustainability of the technology, because as academics, we often like design a thing, write a paper, and then we're like, bye. But then it's the communities that are the ones who have to maintain it if they want it to be useful. And so, I mean, I think there have been a lot of really good examples of this. The tricky thing with AI systems is that the larger models are very much coming from a couple of big corporations. And there's a couple of issues with that. One, communities do not trust those big corporations. Like I actually have a friend who has been working at Google for a long time, and it's really hard to get communities in the Bay Area to sign on to be a, to help Google make a thing when they've experienced all of the negative impacts of having those companies in their neighborhoods. But the other tricky thing is that these models are pre-trained, and people are coming, individuals and groups with their own interests are coming into the process necessarily, for technical reasons after the models have already mostly, are ready to go. And then the community members really end up being in this more reactive mode. And so I've seen a couple of good examples of this. So one is actually sort of using community members, sort of asking like, what would you want this model to do? And if so, is it doing this now? How could it be made better? And ensuring that community members want these types of larger AI models to impact their lives in any way. The second thing that I've seen, I'm thinking in particular, there's a set of projects around women's health and asking women in health contexts, like very often you want to get advice or information from someone who's not a doctor before you decide whether or not you want to seek out medical care. Saying, well, maybe a chatbot or something like this could be instructive because it's not a human, it's not, sort of like a low stakes interaction. How could this be helpful? But these projects very crucially, like, do not train a chatbot and then say like, hey, is this working for you? Because we don't know, again, like I was talking with that AI scribe example, we cannot yet control the factual nature of the information, what the bot will or will not say to any individual. But these projects ask people like, what would you want this? Like if there were to be a chatbot that could help you, what would you want it to do? What kind of information would you want it to provide? In what context, under what conditions would you want this thing? And in what context and under what conditions would you not? And very crucially, the outcomes of projects like these are not like a thing that is made, but a set of guidelines for the development of future technologies. And again, this is sort of a way to allow communities in the visioning of future technologies rather than just to sort of be given a thing and have to evaluate it after the fact. So that's helpful, yeah. Yeah, there's a question over there.
A follow-up question, because these models are here. We are being encouraged to use them. We're being told they're not going away. So I'm wondering whether you have any suggestions for kind of strategies of resistance in using them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the strategies of resistance are all these, is a lot of education and is very contextual, right? Because the reality is that in many contexts, these chatbots and stuff like are kind of useful. And so people are going to use them. But I think the really important thing to do is to balance the use against all of the stuff that is hidden from the actual encounter that you have between you and like a ChatGPT, right? And so people don't always know about, for example, the tremendous energy cost. They don't know about the fact that a lot of the like de-biasing that is happening, so these models are not outright racist to us, actually is undertaken by real people in the world, usually in the global south, who are underpaid for that work, right? People do not know that anything they type in there is captured by these companies and then is recycled as future training data. People don't know that all of these companies are like, have total start to finish control over model training, model design, model deployment, evidently self-regulation, like every single thing. And so I think that, to me, it's like any other thing that has some positives, but also has a lot of negatives. And once you are aware of the outcomes that are deliberately hidden from you or the implications, then I think we can all start to make informed choices about the conditions under which we might use these technologies and the conditions under which we want to use our knowledge and our training to say, like, this is not called for here. I do not want to contribute to whatever this is that's going on here. I'm going to take a different path. And I think that's true as like a user, but also in our research too. And that's something that I'm a little bit conflicted about because everyone wants you to have an opinion about AI, but in a way, we're all sort of playing into this AI hype cycle, right?
Hi, I'm a data analytics major here at Denison. So you talk about rethinking the binary thing in data. So like, how do you like redefine the binary system that is already in place, like qualitative versus quantitative, or like big versus small data sets, or something similar like that?
Oh, I love that question. That's such a good question. I mean, I think you pretty much just said it, right? Like you need to challenge the binary and the hierarchy between big versus small, quantitative versus qualitative, and really advocate for this sort of mixed methods approach or an ecumenical approach to data size and things like this. I mean, I think, I personally would like to see all research contain all components of things because I think that, like, as a good feminist, I feel like you always learn more when you have different approaches and different methods being brought together. That's ultimately how you gain a more complete picture of the total overall thing. But I think on a more practical level, especially people who are sort of benefiting from the ability to speak in technical language, to be at the table when decisions are being made about research design, people who can say, like, wait, I'm not really sure that a quantitative approach is necessary here. Or, hey, I know that data set is bigger, but it still isn't everything. There's really important data that's missing from that data set. Or we might get better findings if we look to a smaller and more carefully curated data set instead of this bigger, sort of more amorphous one. Like those are decisions that I think you can make sort of on an individual basis and like, when at any point during a particular project. And then I think also more broadly, because they're really, really important. And I think without questioning them, it's easy, again, to sort of default to just sort of what people presume to be the thing that gives you the best results. I think there's a question over here.
Hi, so I'm a senior here at Denison, and I have a question maybe more broadly about like, since I care about the usage of AI in the classroom, within the course, it can be within any disciplinary. So I'm having a class with a professor who just had a 2-year sabbatical leave, and he just came back like when he left Denison, it was before ChatGPT, and after that one, he came back and then he was kind of confused about like what can be the right usage of AI in the class, and also like what can be the biases, what can be the wrong usage of AI within the class. So can you give your own thought about like what kind of what are the guidelines that can be made in the classes that can be about like the usage of AI for the homework, and also like what are the possible the potential harms that it can make like to the student and to the learning of that course. Can be also about gender as well. I'm very curious about like how it can affect the gender issue and the race issues as well.
Yeah, sure. It's actually very funny because I am that professor. So I last taught, so I teach this like NLP or like natural language processing methods class. And I last taught it in fall 2022, which I remember because ChatGPT was launched in November. And I was telling my students in the classroom, I was like, hey guys, you might want to check out this new chatbot. It's actually really cool. And I could tell it was November, so not everyone was paying attention, but I could tell the students who were listening to me and those who weren't, because the ones who were listening and went to the ChatGPT URL, they just were like the biggest eyes you've ever seen, and like half the class was asleep or whatever. So then I went on sabbatical, and then I came back, and now I'm teaching the same class this semester, and everything has changed. So I've been thinking about this. In my personal philosophy, and this is actually something that Catherine and I thought a lot about, because I think it's in many ways like a little bit of a controversial position. We're not on the side of refusal with respect to technology. Like, one of the things that Catherine and I had to decide in writing Data Feminism was whether we were going to sort of advocate for the possibility that data and data science could be used for liberatory ends, or whether we wanted to give more space to the people on the side of like, this is so hopelessly corrupted, it's coming out of this 19th century tradition of eugenics, everything has to do with normative, outright eugenicists approaches to everything, like it just needs to all be thrown in the trash. And we thought through this a lot, and we ultimately landed on the side of the belief that things could be done for good with data if they were done intentionally and with care, right? And I think actually this is coming out of a lot of my work in digital humanities, where digital humanities people often have a very similar approach where we inherit these somewhat older technologies that may or may not have been designed for like military reasons or totally out of context. And we think, you know, there has to be a way to use them to generate knowledge, to further human understanding. And in digital humanities, that has been the case, you know, when you think really hard and contextually about their use. I mean, I think the tricky thing with AI, AI seems different, which is why I'm more hesitant to be like, oh, certainly we all need to sign on. For the reasons that I mentioned before, we didn't even talk about questions of sort of content and copyright and all of the creative work that's being sort of subsumed into these models. And also, I think this idea that somehow we are all sort of, our own learning experience is being dictated to us from essentially 3 companies, which is really only one. It's like when OpenAI decides that they're gonna release a model that does a new thing, everyone in the world and everyone in the academy needs to react because students have access to it. It is free. I mean, with an asterisk, but like it is free. And so I think those are some reasons that make me want to push back against the sort of like blanket embrace of AI, and even push me to want to essentially like rant at you like I'm doing right now every single time I get this question. But I will say this, I teach a technical methods class in ChatGPT, or actually not as much ChatGPT, but like the like AI code complete is really good, you know? Like it speeds up my work a lot. And for that reason, I can see how it probably will be a skill that people, as soon as they graduate from college, will be asked to use in the workplace. And for that reason, I think for me, it's sort of not off the table. The one thing I will say, and this is true both for the more sort of writing kind of tasks that you can ask Gen AI to do and also the more technical ones, you need to have a baseline before you understand how to make these tools work for you. And I can really tell already the difference between students who are like juniors and seniors who have already acquired that baseline, and they can either sort of prompt the model appropriately so that it gives them exactly what they want, or when it doesn't, they can be like, oh no, that's wrong, I'm gonna do it again. Same thing with writing. When you use it to sort of like prompt you a thing, you can be like, oh, that's kind of mediocre, and you know exactly what to do in order to fix it. Whereas the first years who have never taken a class at the university level don't have that ability. And I do worry that, and we're actually being told this by Sam Altman, and I guess like his son, there was that thing recently where he's like, my son learned a whole bunch from my mom. Like, we're being told that that's enough. And it is so clearly not enough, right? And so, yes, I think that professors are going to need to adapt. Yes, I also think, I'm also like upset about the fact that we are being forced rather than voluntarily adapting. But I also think that we need to insist that what we are learning in college is really important. Because if you do not have that baseline, no one is going to be able to push anything forward. We're just going to be stuck regurgitating falsely or incorrectly the things that are fed to us.
Hi, I was curious, like when you were first writing the original book in like 2019 and 2020 and stuff, what were there like what were like the different things that you were like interested in at the time with like data feminism that is different from now when we have all this AI stuff?
Oh, I keep on forgetting that I have a microphone too. I'm like, wait, I needed to talk, but no, I don't. I have it in my pocket. You know, I think that the bigger things, I think there were questions of scale, right? And so the range of possible data projects that you can do, you could do big data projects or small data projects. You could do like handmade data projects. I mean, you can still do these things, but with AI, like everything is big, right? And so the amount of space, and I would say notably the amount of attention that people get now for doing a small bespoke data project is much, much smaller. And in many ways, that makes, unfortunately, the projects less effective when what you're trying to do is use your data science to advocate for change. And so that's one of the differences. Another difference that I've seen, again, and I keep on coming back to the sort of corporate capture of these AI technologies, like now when you're using AI, there's always some corporation who you need to be interfacing with. It's a lot harder to be developing your own projects from the ground up that are independent of fears over corporate surveillance, them taking your data, even having to, even give your time, attention, money to a company whose ethical stance you disagree with so strongly. It's not impossible to do, but all of the forces are sort of pushing us in this very narrow corridor. Whereas I think a couple of years ago, when the focus was more on data, it opened up a lot more possibilities for people, and it also was able to bring a lot more voices into the room. And I actually think, I have been starting to see, even from people working in these big tech companies or adjacent to these tech companies, a growing realization that these models are actually really bad at anything that has to do with a smaller group of people, a more specific area of knowledge, the kinds of things that you do learn from sort of local or highly curated or deeply contextualized data sets. I wonder if there's not going to be some sort of return to an emphasis and valuation of that. But right now, to me, that seems like the biggest change. It's like there's not a lot more air in the room for projects that really try to take seriously what we know to be true, which is local, contextualized, and sort of ground up knowledge is one of the best and most legitimate sources of knowledge that we all know to exist.
Thank you so much for your talk. So as you mentioned, other people have appreciated in your book the sort of your ability to bring these tangible examples to illustrate these theoretical concepts. And something else that I really appreciated is when you got to the end of your talk, how you emphasized envisioning the future. And personally, I find that I'm well trained to critique and not as well trained to envision. So I'm just curious if you would be willing to share personally some sort of vision for a data feminist future in the age of AI that's tangible and might help us think about other ways that we could bring these futures about?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question. I mean, I think, it's really interesting. So I run this big grant program in Atlanta. It's called the Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network. And when we pitched it to the funders, I really did think that it was possible to envision sort of informed, intentional, socially just applications of AI. And we're now sort of a year and a half in, and my conclusion is honestly that AI is mostly bad. I mean, I think that the generative use cases are really few and far between. I mean, I think there are some really good use cases having to do with accessibility, right? So, accessibility, especially for digital environments, is often given the short shrift when it comes to providing alt text, for example, that describes what an image looks like for people who are blind or low vision, or use screen readers, things like that. A lot of the translation, machine translation, it can be really effective. So translating from one to another. And I do feel like there are these sort of pockets of examples where over a very involved process of building relationships and trust with community members, researchers are able to identify small parts of community processes that can be improved with AI. Catherine's project is one of them. The one about the sort of maternal health chatbot one is another one that I really like a lot. But I think my takeaway is that, the future that we if what we want is an equitable future in which we do sort of make available opportunities for everyone, AI is very often not the answer. And as much as we don't want to be the critics of AI, because I feel you, I work in a department where people think critical data studies means that people hate data. And it's no, I love data. I just am also very critical of it. But I think that we really need to educate ourselves. We need to work with these tools so that we understand what they can do and what they can't. And in almost all situations, when they are not the right solution to a problem that is being raised, we need to be the ones who are able to say, like, we don't want this. We want to encourage a different future that is not reliant on these kinds of tools.
Oh, I feel so bad to be like the closing remark of this wonderful talk. So, um, we all know that like AI is like a legacy of some really bad things that happened in the past, like eugenics and stuff. But how do you address like the remnants of eugenics being like an spearheading force for our future? So it's pretty contradicting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge this history, and this is something that is not done enough in sort of like general statistics classes and things like this. I mean, I think most technologies that we work with have sort of surfaced from pretty bad origins, right? Like even like the internet was originally a military project, like topic modeling, which is a technique that we use all over the digital humanities, was initially like newswire surveillance system. Like there's a lot of ways in which sort of technology more broadly has been deeply complicit and come up through military aims. You know, there has just as equally been a really long line of work across a lot of fields that's attempted to reclaim military technologies for humanity, for art, for things like that. And so one line is just to sort of acknowledge the history and intentionally sort of move beyond it and say, like, I'm not going to do that. I know that history, and I'm taking steps to ensure that I do not reproduce it. And ideally, my goal is to push back against it. But I think that sort of more subtly, some of the legacies of the sort of modeling approaches that come up from eugenic theory go a lot less questioned in these systems, and ultimately are, in many cases, the reason why they do not serve like non-normative populations, right? Like all of these large language models predict their stuff on the basis of a probability distribution aiming towards the center, right? And like that whole idea that what we want is like, mostly the center, this comes up to us from eugenic theory, right? And I think this is obvious to anyone who's tried to ask ChatGPT or anything like this to do something that is like a little bit out of the ordinary. And yes, there are things you can do. You can adjust like the temperature, you can adjust like the window from which the distribution, the individual probabilities are selected. Like you can play around with it a little bit. But I think, one of the things that we all will increasingly realize as we try to push these tools to their limits is they are not designed to do anything more than sort of reproduce the status quo. And I think in that reason, we really need to push ourselves to say, like, what are we missing because we're using these technologies that have been so narrowly constrained? What are the tools and methods that might amplify experiences and language and sort of cultures on the margins? And maybe they're not these methods, right? And I think some thinking like that can come from returning to the origins of a lot of the sort of default approaches that are baked into the way these tools are designed.